Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Carlos Martin, a project director for the Center's Remodeling Futures program, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk with Dr. Robin Bartram, author of Stacked Decks, Building Inspectors and the Reproduction of Urban Inequality. Now, before I introduce Dr. Bartram, I want to let you know of a few other upcoming events that we'll be hosting at the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and a little bit more about our Remodeling Futures program. So we have a big lineup this whole term. Our fall events continue on Friday, November 18th, so in about 2 weeks, at 12:15 p.m. with a discussion titled Helping Older Americans During the Pandemic, the Role of Service Coordinators. And that online event will be the third in a four-part series exploring some of the key findings in advancing housing and health equity for older adults, pandemic innovations, and policy ideas. So a report released last month by the Center and Hastings Institute. So speakers will include Samara Scheckler, our colleague, a research associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies and co-author of a forthcoming paper on service coordinators, as well as Amy Schechtman, president and CEO of Two Life Communities, and others. And my colleague, Jen Malinsky, who directs the Center's Housing on Aging Society program, will also moderate that session. And then on Friday, December 2nd, also at 12:15 p.m., I'll vacate the moderator's chair to give an online presentation myself titled Keeping the Decarbonized, in parentheses, Lights On, U.S. Housing Equity and the Energy Transition. So more information about these and other Joint Center activities is available on our website. That's jchs.harvard.edu, and we'll post that on the website as well as in our chat later on. So let me give you a little background about the Remodeling Futures program in the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which for over 2 decades has studied the remodeling industry, including changes in the types and costs of projects that homeowners undertake, such as the growing interest in energy efficiency products in healthy housing and smart home technologies. So our program issues a biennial Improving America's Housing report, and which will be coming out in this spring in 2023. We create a quarterly leading indicator of remodeling activity, the LIRA, and other publications. Over the past year, we have also focused on the broader inventory of existing housing, some of which are being remodeled and some of which suffer from a range of physical quality challenges, from basic health and safety to energy efficiency and disaster resilience performance that are becoming increasingly essential. When we look at disparities at the rates of remodeling and repair between housing types, the nature of homes occupied by the low to moderate income households quickly come to the surface. I invite you to review the blog post produced by our team, including Abby Will and Sophia Wedeen and Taylor Maines on low to moderate income homeowners and their remodeling rates and project types, as well as on municipal assistance repair programs for the low to moderate income households, elderly and physically challenged homeowners and renters. Given our interest in the quality of existing housing, you can imagine how pleased we were to have Dr. Bartram speak in the Center series. Dr. Bartram is currently an assistant professor of sociology at Tulane University, where she's been over the past 4 years, since completing her master's and doctorate degrees in sociology at Northwestern University. At Northwestern, Dr. Bartram was also a presidential fellow and legal studies affiliate and on the legal studies affiliate committee. She did her undergraduate study in social anthropology and in Russian at Sussex University in the UK. Sorry, I'm an American. I always have trouble with these British words. And Dr. Bartram's research and teaching interests range from across urban sociology and social policy, environmental justice and housing inequality, and legal studies and organizational and cultural sociology. In short, Dr. Bartram is a scholar posing a comprehensive and insightful set of questions about existing housing, and we look forward to asking her questions and talking about them over the course of what we anticipate will be a promising career. So, like I said, it brings us great pleasure to use this venue to introduce her first book, Stacked Decks, Building Inspectors and the Reproduction of Urban Inequality, published this year by the University of Chicago Press. So and I'm inviting Dr. Bartram. Great, she's on the screen. So we're excited to hear about Dr. Bartram's overview, but I'm obliged to take this moment to remind all participants that you are muted in audio, but encouraged to post questions via the chat function on Zoom. You can ask questions of clarification and substance, but please refrain from commentary that is not followed by a question for Dr. Bartram. We will be monitoring that to make sure that you have questions and don't try to slip in a commentary. Or if you do, make sure that you're at least asking a question and being clever on how you include your question. So Dr. Bartram will talk for about 25 to 30 minutes. That will leave us about 20 to 25 minutes for questions, which you can put, and again, which you can pose via the Q&A chat. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all your questions, right? And with that, I will pass it to Dr. Bartram.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Let me just share my screen, and I assume that everyone can see that clearly. Thanks. Okay, great. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to talk about my book, which just came out this summer. So before I talk more specifically about the book, I want to mention an article in the Chicago Tribune from just last year called "The Failures Before the Fires." This is a really great article. It's based on some very in-depth analysis of City of Chicago records, and it actually won a Pulitzer Award. And the article concludes that in Chicago, in 6 years, 61 people died in buildings where the city knew of fire safety issues. So the subtext of this headline is that the city knew these buildings were dangerous because they had records of building code violations. Of course, many other fatalities and injuries occur in buildings that aren't on the city's radar as being dangerous. But clearly there's a particular problem if a city government knows about dangerous buildings but can't prevent deadly fires. And one of the reasons this is a problem, I think, is because there is a system in place intended to do this very job, the system of building code enforcement. So clearly there's a problem, there's some kind of problem with building code enforcement. But I also think this article points to a different kind of problem. So the article mentions building code inspectors, the people who enforce building code and are supposed to prevent tragic fires like these, 54 times. It mentions them 54 times without actually talking to them. And I think this is another kind of problem. Of course, there may be good reasons why journalists have a hard time getting access to talk to people like building inspectors. But in general, if we don't talk to people on the ground who implement policies, and in this case are charged with enforcing building codes that prevent deadly fires, how can we really know what the problem with code enforcement is? So this is in many ways what is at the heart of my book. The book shines a light on the work of city building inspectors in Chicago and explains why it is that in cities like Chicago and elsewhere, there are such vast disparities in housing conditions. It also helps to explain why tenants still deal with slumlords, even though building code enforcement was designed over 100 years ago, in part as a way to curtail slumlordism. It also helps to explain the persistence of dangerous buildings and why deadly fires occur despite a framework intended to prevent all of this. So the book shows that inspectors make difficult decisions and argues overall that code enforcement as it stands right now does not really provide recourse to effectively ensure safe and decent housing. So I'll get to these points shortly. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what building code enforcement actually is. So it varies from municipality and city to city, but when I'm talking about building code enforcement in Chicago, I'm referring to inspections carried out by city building inspectors in response to service requests from residents about things like aging bricks that need tuck pointing, landlords not providing heat or smoke detectors, dangerous porches, overgrown weeds in yards, flaky paint on windows, also things like bed bugs, cockroaches, rats. So if anyone in the audience has called their city government about a landlord not making repairs or a neighbor's fence falling into your yard, or any of the things on the slide, the people who respond are the people I'm talking about today. So most cities have some kind of system like this. In Chicago and elsewhere, it's 311. So you can call 311 or lodge a request online and a building inspector will eventually respond. In Cambridge, where the Joint Centre for Housing Studies is located, I believe you'd call the Department of Inspectional Services. So there's usually some kind of system like this in place. In Chicago, over a 10-year period, inspectors recorded over 982,000 311 prompted violations of Chicago's municipal building code. And this is a breakdown for some of the most frequent types of violations. So you'll hear about a range of these throughout the talk today, but you can see things like windows, missing smoke detectors, and exterior walls are the most commonly recorded violations. I also want to draw your attention to the number of recorded illegal conversions, which is the second category down on this chart. So this refers to basements and sometimes attics that have been converted into living spaces without the building owner getting the correct permits to ensure they're up to code. So commonly they aren't up to code because they lack enough points of egress, for example, or enough light and ventilation. They've also been making headlines recently because of increased flooding in many areas. So because basement units are below ground level, they're the first unit in any building to flood. And only last year in New York City, 11 residents of basement apartments died because of floodwater from Hurricane Ida. And I expect this is going to become increasingly a big issue that we need to talk about and to do something about. So I'll talk more about basement apartments in a moment and some additional problems they pose as well. So two other important things to know about the kind of scope of building code enforcement in Chicago. So buildings can and do receive multiple violations per inspection. The mean number per inspection is 8, but I saw inspectors record 0 violations in some buildings, and I saw them record over 30 in others. So inspections can also produce a variety of consequences. Most often in Chicago, and I'll be curious to know how this is in other places as well, inspections result in a notice sent to the property owner in question. In cases that inspectors deem serious, they send property owners to court to mandate repairs. Inspections can also lead to substantial fines, demolitions, and evictions. So clearly the outcomes of inspections matter. But as I began my research, the first thing that really hit me was the amount of discretion that inspectors have in deciding what to do when their inspections turn up violations, which they invariably do. Because as I very quickly learned during my research, all buildings have violations. So inspectors love to tell me they could find violations even in brand new buildings. And apparently, as Inspector Paul told me, also in the White House as well. So all buildings have violations. But not all violations result in a citation or a court case. So when I found this out, my mission really became finding the answers to 2 questions. If all buildings have violations, what do inspectors consider about people and buildings when deciding what course of action to take? And second, how do these decisions aggregate with respect to existing trends in housing inequality in the city? And I really tried to get at these questions from every angle possible. So first, I worked as an intern at the Chicago Department of Buildings, which eventually got me access to interviews and ride-alongs with inspectors as they went out on inspections and made decisions about what counted as building code violations. These ride-alongs covered the whole city, a whole range of violations, all kinds of different buildings. Every day and every inspection was really markedly different. So one inspection, I'd be straining my eyes looking for evidence of bed bugs. And the next, I'd find myself treading carefully on burnt out floorboards in a building that had been partially destroyed by a gas explosion. I also sat in on housing court cases, interviewed judges and attorneys, and conducted a mini neighborhood study for which I attended community meetings, interviewed residents, landlords, and local elected officials. And throughout the book, I put my qualitative data in conversation with some quantitative analysis of building violation records, 311 service requests, census data, and housing market data as well. So using some of this data, I'm going to take the next 20 or so minutes to describe how inspectors make decisions and then discuss some implications of those decisions. And the crux of what I'm going to demonstrate is that time and time again, inspectors very explicitly make what I call stabs at justice. In particular, as I'm going to demonstrate, inspectors organize their work around going easy on homeowners and small-time landlords they perceive to be low or moderate income. By contrast, they go after professional landlords, they opt to more heavily penalize them and people they think can afford to maintain buildings but fail to. And just a note on my terminology, I I talk about this a lot more in depth in the book, but stabs at justice is a term that I use to capture kind of small scale, immediate attempts to even things out in the moment at hand, to kind of make things fairer in the moment at hand. So in what follows, I'll demonstrate some examples of these stabs at justice and then discuss some implications. So I'll begin by introducing you to Inspector Malcolm. And by the way, all the names I use in the book and in this talk are all pseudonyms. These are not Inspector's real names. So I joined Inspector Malcolm for an inspection one day, and I saw him making a stab at justice by going easy on behalf of a small-time landlord. So like most inspectors, Malcolm is white. He grew up in a working class neighborhood in Chicago that was home to mostly Polish Americans before most left for the suburbs during white flight. I accompanied Malcolm to a building that had been reported to have an illegal basement conversion. So this is one of those illegal conversions from the chart that I showed earlier. As we pulled up to the building, we were met by the owner, a Latino man in his 60s, who showed us the now empty basement and pointed out that the kitchen that had been in the corner had been removed, meaning he could no longer rent it out as a separate apartment. So despite this, Malcolm could still technically have insisted that the owner get retroactive permits, which would require hiring an architect on top of paying city fees. And inspectors ask this of property owners all the time. This is kind of by the books building code enforcement. But in this instance, Malcolm opted not to force the owner to get permits, nor to write him up for some issues with the basement windows that he'd noticed around the side of the building. And as became customary, he explained his decision to me as we got back into his truck. This guy, he told me, in this 2-flat, probably doesn't have a lot of money. Plus, he's just lost the revenue from renting out the basement. I don't want to pile on extra for this guy. Telling me he guessed that in this area, which was a rapidly changing but historically Latinx neighborhood, the owner would be losing between $600 and $700 per month from renting out the basement. So he saw his decision as a way of helping out this small-time landlord, who he assumed didn't have much money. There was an additional reason for his leniency, though. So he told me later that he suspected that development companies were responsible for making initial 311 calls in situations like this, in efforts to drive down property prices or prompt owners to sell so they could kind of snap them up in changing and increasingly lucrative areas. He told me that contrary to an average home buyer who likely wouldn't know what counted as an illegal basement or not, developers are savvy about what violations are and what counts. So Malcolm had a full plate of inspections this day, but he still spent some time talking to the landlord about how much it would cost to hire an architect and offered him some advice about grandfathering a garage into the building code. I point these things out because I want to be clear that inspectors overlooking issues like Malcolm had done for this property owner is not a matter of neglect. It's not that inspectors just don't care what happens. Rather, it's a stab at justice, an effort to, in Malcolm's words, not pile on extra. And I heard this rhetoric a lot, inspectors telling me they didn't want to add to the headaches of struggling property owners. So Inspector Malcolm's assessment stemmed from his assumption about the financial status and the struggle of the building owner. An inspector's sense of compassion is particularly heightened when they believe profiteers are further stacking the deck. This is really exemplified in the following excerpt from Danny, who, like Malcolm, is a white inspector. He's been an inspector for 14 years, and he has a loud, booming voice and a beard. So during an interview, Danny recalled trying to help a woman whose family home was in such a bad state that it was close to being recommended for demolition. He told me the woman was Black, was a single mother, and had been holding down numerous jobs until her car broke down, causing her to lose the jobs and thus the ability to pay her mortgage. What I'm running into is people that are stuck in between, Danny told me. They're trying to make it in a market sense, but their mortgage got out of control. They're in foreclosure, and their principal, interest, and taxes are $3,000 a month. And that's just outrageous for a 2-flat in this neighborhood. So Danny's sympathy for this woman was rooted in her financial status and her struggle to kind of make it as a property owner when the odds were stacked against her. And now her home that had been in her family for 2 generations was facing demolition. So luckily, Danny knew enough about the building code and what tips a building over the scale to be put on the city's demolition schedule. He was able to cite the building for its severe issues, but did not recommend it for demolition. So inspectors like Danny and Malcolm make stabs at justice on behalf of low and moderate income property owners. And because of the history of housing discrimination and other denials of wealth, these property owners tend to be residents of color. I saw this in action during my fieldwork such as the examples I just described. But it's also backed up by the numbers. So I have an article in the journal City and Community that provides some statistical evidence of these trends over time. So this is one half of the story I want to tell today. The other half is that, along with their resolve to go easy on low-income homeowners, inspectors frequently spoke of their determination to go after the bad guys. So bad guys for inspectors are usually bad landlords, developers, and people they believe profit from negligence. So, for example, I had joined Inspector Nick at a 2-story vacant brick building when we discovered the owner's building permit did not cover the gut rehab that was underway. The rooms were full of construction material. It actually made it really hard to walk through the building. And 3 workers had just stopped for lunch after just finishing drywall in the entire first floor. You might want to stop working at this point, Nick said, kind of quietly to the workers. The owner's going to have to get a new permit. So a couple of things surprised me about this. I was surprised by Nick's lack of insistence, and I was surprised by his almost whispering tone. I'd seen him get pretty riled up in some buildings in the past. But he later explained that he hadn't told them they must stop work, nor had he put an official stop work order on the building, which he could easily have done with just a stroke of the pen, because he wanted to make the owner learn the hard way. So instead of stopping the work, Nick let them work on, knowing that his write-up would insist on the removal of all the drywall in the building, just to have an inspector check the wiring behind it, and then they'd have to replace the drywall all over again. This would be costly for the owner and also, perhaps more importantly, really annoying. But it would also, Nick reasoned, mean the owner would have to pay the workers for this extra work, who, Nick told me, probably have kids to feed. So Nick seemed to relish the power he had to penalize the property owner, and I soon learned why. In the car later on, he told me that based on the finish of the rehab, things like the granite countertops and the chrome appliances, he thought the owner of the building was planning on flipping the property and would thus be passing the insufficient permit issues on to the next owner. So here then, Nick opted to heavily penalize someone he thought was trying to profit by taking shortcuts, while also trying to protect the workers and the future owner of the building. So I like this example because it shows 2 different kinds of stabs at justice, going easy and going after in one inspection. So we've just seen an inspector make a stab at justice towards someone who he thought was a property flipper. But most universally, the bad guys for inspectors are professional landlords and other property owners who inspectors believe can afford to maintain buildings because they're bringing in rental income that they often fail to. So for the last inspection one afternoon, I accompanied Inspector Eddie to a 6th flat in a high poverty neighborhood. As I walked up, I heard Eddie mutter, "There are some poor people in this place." Before I could respond, a man approached us to tell us that he was the one who made the initial 311 call a few months earlier about a lack of electricity and cockroaches, and he led us inside his apartment where he lived with his wife. So the couple, who were both Black and I think in their 20s, pointed out numerous violations throughout their apartment that the landlord had refused to fix, ranging from holes in the walls, clogged drains, the kitchen and bathroom ceilings that were thick with orange mold. The back porch was unstable, the back gate was kind of permanently padlocked, and various kinds of insects were in plain sight on the kitchen walls and floors. The landlord had also failed to provide heat last winter or electricity for the past 3 months. And this was the height of the summer. But because there was no electricity, the couple couldn't use air conditioning units or even fans. So the couple were disgusted with the condition of their apartment and their landlord's negligence. And Inspector Eddie seemed to be too. He was furiously scribbling notes the whole time, telling the couple that he was sending the landlord straight to court and wanted to get every detail down. As we were leaving, he asked them what they pay for rent. I asked, he explained, because when I pray for landlords to go to landlord hell, it's based on how much rent they charge for a shithole. He said this after finding out their rent was $7.50 a month. So as Eddie promised, the write-up for this building lists many violations, 35 in fact, some of which you can see here. The court case against the owner would likely force her to fix many or all of these issues or sell the building. Sure enough, I drove by the building a year or so after Eddie's inspection. There were new windows and a new back porch. But what became of the tenants and how the repairs affect the rent they pay is another question. And I'm going to get to this very shortly. But just to summarize where we are at this point, what I've shown so far is that inspectors make stabs at justice. They go easy on struggling homeowners and those they perceive to be low or moderate income. They go after professional landlords and people they think can afford to maintain buildings, but fail to. So back to the question of what happens to buildings and tenants after inspections. So I did some digging. I sat in on housing court cases and I gathered housing market data. And the following is what I found. So first, let's talk about rental buildings. So as I've shown, inspectors come down hard on some rental properties by listing as many violations as possible and insisting issues get resolved. So if we think back to the landlord of the unit with the orange moldy ceilings that I just mentioned, based on my analysis of rental prices and building code violation data, if she fixes those 35 violations, she could be expected to raise the rent in that unit from $7.50 to $9.26 the following year. If she fixed none, the rent will be $7.71 based on the average increase for that tract. So that's over a $150 increase from what we could otherwise expect, which is a lot, particularly in a neighborhood where 3/4 of renters make incomes that put them below the poverty line. A new monthly rent of $9.26 would eat up almost 70% of that income. I think it's probably hard for many of us to imagine how little money that leaves people for other daily expenses, not to mention, let's say, the expenses of trying to find a new place to live. For a home to be affordable, housing costs are supposed to be no more than 30% of a household's income. So this rent is really wildly unaffordable for this neighborhood. Beyond this one building, fixing violations is associated with rent increases, either because landlords need to do this to cover costs or because they use repairs as an excuse to rehab units, for example, and then charge higher rents. Overall, higher rents make cities less affordable, and this has disproportionate impact on people with the fewest resources. There are also important impacts for owner-occupied buildings. So inspectors make stabs at justice here by not insisting low-income homeowners fix all their violations. I saw this in housing court where judges and court inspectors allow low-income property owners months and months and sometimes years to try to fix their issues. Like when an inspector agreed to allow a woman extra time to complete some repairs on her porch. So the woman was white, looked to be in her 20s, and hushed her baby in a stroller during the court case. Like many others in building court, the woman's home had a porch that desperately needed repairs. Some of the steps had rotted and the handrails were loose. Her father, who had taken care of the building, had died a few years ago, and her mother was housebound. And the unit they had rented on the 3rd floor of the building was now vacant, meaning they weren't even bringing in any rental income at all at this point. So this was her second court date, and she had promised to have made progress on the porch by now. She showed the inspector photos on her phone of some work she had completed, including removing some debris and fixing some door glass. But nothing had been done to the porch. The inspector looked at her. "Your family has owned the building for a long time, right?" he asked, and watched as the woman nodded. Finding out that the family were longtime owners with few resources was all he seemed to need to know. He agreed to allow her more time to fix the porch. In the meantime, Unresolved violations, like rotting wood porches, deteriorate and become more dangerous. Violations also remain on records for buildings in question, cloud titles, lead to liens and foreclosure, and are associated with lower property prices. They can also prevent property owners from getting loans and refinancing. And remember, inspectors are more likely to not insist violations get fixed in buildings in low-income neighborhoods, which in Chicago are mostly in communities of color. So in spite of inspectors' compassion towards struggling property owners, housing inequality persists. So to sum up, what I'm trying to show here is that the housing market really subverts stabs at justice for renters and for homeowners. The for-profit rental market and the lack of rent control means that stabs at justice perpetuate the affordable housing, perpetuate the lack of affordable housing in decent condition for renters, and means that landlords are able to profit from both repairs and disrepair. For owner-occupiers, the lack of resources for home repairs means that stabs at justice can only really reinforce the divide between wealthy and poor homeowners. In both contexts, housing inequality is reproduced. Those at the bottom of the rental market face increasingly unaffordable housing options, and poor homeowners face additional financial struggles. But I want to make an important qualification, which is that inspectors don't really have options to make a difference to housing inequality in the current system of building code enforcement. So in the current system of code enforcement and in its current housing market, doing the converse of their stabs at justice would not really help either. So demanding low-income property owners make all their repairs promptly is unrealistic, and it prompts displacement, debt, and further financial struggles. And letting landlords off the hook is not likely to do much to help tenants' living conditions either, because it removes the legal imperative to provide safe and decent housing. And inspectors know this. They know they can only do so much, and they are to some extent kind of caught in a catch-22. So what I think the example of code enforcement shows is that the organization of housing markets renders stabs at justice ineffectual. So again, the book shows that inspectors make difficult decisions. Sometimes they're surprising, but it also argues that code enforcement does not really provide recourse to effectively ensure safe and decent housing. So where does this leave us? I think as things stand, buildings will continue to collapse, houses will burn down, and communities face cycles of dilapidation. In part, this is because all buildings age, dilapidate, decay over time due to the combination of construction materials and weather. All buildings need repairs at some point. And it takes a lot of resources to maintain a building, meaning repairs are always going to disproportionately impact those with the fewest resources. And this is particularly the case for low-income property owners of color due to the historical and contemporary real estate practices that have targeted them for mortgages on buildings in disrepair. But if building owners have access to some kind of program to cover the cost of repairs, I think it's reasonable to suggest that there would not have been 61 deaths in 6 years in Chicago buildings, if you think back to the article that I started this talk off with. And resources for repairs, along with a system of rent control, could go a long way to prevent landlords using repairs as justification for rent hikes. So finally, while we all know that code enforcement doesn't work as it should, I think the evidence kind of surrounds us. We need to walk in the shoes of building inspectors and other people who are charged with implementing policies to really understand why things don't work and why inequality is so persistent. We need to hear from people like inspectors to understand what they're up against. They're the ones, after all, who work within the laws that get passed and implement the policies and programs that get rolled out. I think we all too often work backward and infer on-the-ground decisions of frontline workers from patterns in data sets, maps, or statistical models. And the irony is, I think, that we need to listen to individuals on the ground, like building inspectors, to see that the solutions do not actually lie at the level of changing individual decisions. Solutions lie instead in the structures and systems in which individuals operate. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bartram. On 2 counts, one for this comprehensive peek into your book that you provided the Joint Center's audience and all of the participants who are here. I'm sure thank you as much as I do for that. But also to have be one of the few scholars to address the subject that is so sorely understudied. And I'd like to talk, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here to talk a little bit about your thinking as a scholar in this space, and how this understudy came to be, and what it means to housing practice and scholarship today. And I recall in an interview you did with Slate magazine that you talked about how you began this inquiry assuming the conventional wisdom, right? About, oh, these are public agents, and likely public inspectors are punishing the poor and households of color through fines and other punitive actions. But then you had sort of an epiphany, and clearly that's not what you found either. So at what point did you personally, as a scholar, hit that realization and break your assumption about what was going on here? Like, was there a specific interview or a specific person that you spoke to, or an event that happened in your analysis?
Yeah, it took a while. So it was not a one kind of moment epiphany. It was a gradual coming to realize that what I was hearing and seeing was the reality. So as you mentioned, I started off this research kind of expecting pretty much the opposite of what I found. And I think there is a whole bunch of both kind of scholarly, but also just kind of, knowledge of the world that would lead to these expectations about people in positions of power, people with discretion, making decisions that kind of routinely punish low-income residents and residents of color. So this is kind of what I was expecting. And then as I started speaking to inspectors, they really just kind of told me very much the opposite. I kept hearing kind of almost verbatim this inspectors telling me, we try and help struggling homeowners. Actually what we're doing is really trying to go after, come down hard on the kind of like the bad guy, the big landlords, sort of big developers. And at first I was skeptical. I thought, okay, you're telling me this because you think this is what I want to hear. So I didn't necessarily completely believe them at first. Then I started going out on inspections with inspectors, and I saw them kind of putting, acting on the same logics, doing as they had told me they were doing. So going easy on struggling homeowners, coming down hard on big landlords, for example. And still I wasn't completely convinced, because I thought, oh, okay, this is perhaps just this one group of inspectors who I have kind of insider information about. This is just the inspectors who I'm seeing, who I'm spending time with. Maybe there's a whole other group of inspectors who are doing quite the opposite. Or maybe these inspectors are only acting this way because I'm in that company. So this is what really encouraged me to do a quantitative portion of this project as well. So I gathered building code violation data for 10 years across the whole city of Chicago, and matched it with some census data, which I have an article all about this if anyone is interested in city and community, to really try and almost test if what I had been seeing on the ground was reality across 10 years and across the whole city. And it was. So I feel like with all of these different sources of data telling me the same thing, I was finally able to accept that this was the reality.
Yeah, I think that's sort of not only is it an understudied, but I think sort of your work really illuminates a lot of the differences that are occurring. And that I definitely want to talk about in terms of cross cities. Beyond Chicago. And the reason I'm asking this question is because so many of the questions that have come in, and we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm really, people keep bringing them in, but I realize I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, so I'm trying to categorize a lot of these. One is this importance about being clear about which kind of building inspector we're talking about, and which specific kind of code or municipal law is being referenced here. So and because in some cases, some of the questions that have come in are saying that in our city, it's very different. We have this, like at the health code, it's a health department, fire department, etc. So let's talk about that difference and why you narrowed in on this specific type of building inspection. So if you could even name the specific municipal code that you're checking so that people understand that.
Yeah, so this is the conservation code in Chicago. And this is the group of inspectors who follow up on calls, 311 calls from residents. So these are not inspectors who go and inspect new construction. These are not inspectors who inspect elevators or do kind of electrical work or plumbing work. This is the group of mostly men who follow up on 311 calls. So and I know in many cities things kind of separated out, sort of quality of life codes versus sort of building codes. It's sort of referred to broadly in Chicago as the building code. And the reason why I chose that group of inspectors is because I think they see the widest variety of housing types, housing conditions, and these are inspections of residential properties where people are already living in them. So I think that this has kind of the most immediate impact on people's well-being.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about these specific inspectors and their professionalization that led them to sort of the behaviors and nuanced behaviors that you're monitoring. So there are some questions around sort of what their training is as opposed to new building inspectors, right? And like the other kinds of code violations that you're mentioning. What was their training on the whole? Like, what was their requirements to be able to even hold the position of building inspectors?
So most of this group of inspectors in Chicago that I spent time with were formerly working in construction, so they have a lot of knowledge about, you know, the kind of the physical stuff, the material stuff of buildings. And in terms of training, the things may well have changed. So my project now, the research for this was a little over 5 years ago, but at that time, the training was mostly informal. So inspectors would kind of begin the job by kind of doing what I was doing, sort of shadowing, like riding along with an existing inspector and sort of picking up training along the way.
Which is very different than some of the other, even in the city of Chicago, building inspectors that are looking for different municipal violations, right? So it's the engineer and architect in me that is fascinated by the kinds of violations. Like I love all your charts, but the chart that showed which were the specific building elements that were the sources of violations were kind of fascinating, because some were clearly health and safety critical elements, and some were a little more aesthetic, like flaky paint and weeds, which border on public nuisance, physical incivilities, blight symptoms, which vary again across cities. Even neighboring cities have totally different rules about what constitutes a violation of a current building. So did the inspectors that you speak to have any sense about how they viewed these different approaches, and that inform, even if tacitly, like what they chose to over enforce or not enforce?
Yeah, I think most inspectors have a kind of implicit or kind of agreed upon notion about what's more important than other stuff. So I think the flaky paint is interesting, because I believe that ordinance, that violation came about because of lead paint. So that's the kind of origins of the concern about flaky paint. Other things like tall weeds, I believe it's to do with rat harborage. But these indeed are two of the violations that inspectors would be more likely to overlook in a building where they kind of wanted to show compassion to the property owner. So there are things that building inspectors are told to and do also kind of personally themselves take very seriously. So things like dangerous porches, missing smoke detectors, and that's one reason why they show up. So there are so many of those recorded violations on that chart, is because these are things that they are almost, I think they're told by the superiors, you know, these are serious things. And there are events in Chicago, for example, a porch collapse, I think in the early 2000s, a very fatal porch collapse, which changed the regulations about porches and meant that inspectors suddenly had to be a lot more aware of potentially dangerous porches. Yeah.
So in addition to the nuance that you provided to the inspectors, there's a nuance about the landlords that I want to talk about. And there were some interesting questions for clarification about, for example, how do you define a small scale landlord versus, like, you know, a large scale slumlord and that sort of thing? Where did you create sort of quantitative measures for that, or was it qualitatively knowing who these
Yeah.
who these owners were?
So this is a really interesting question. So I went on inspectors' judgment of what counts as a. I kind of, I went along with them. Whatever they thought, that's how I was interpreting it as well. And in terms of interpreting who is the landlord, what kind of landlord it is, I mean, very often it comes down to the size of the building. So if it is a 2-flat or a 3-flat building, a small rental building that perhaps historically is more likely to have been owner occupied, that was kind of one of the telltale signs to inspectors that this is a small time landlord, someone who deserves our kind of sympathy, our compassion in this kind of struggling housing in this, hard housing market. Versus big buildings versus kind of fancy new flashy developments. So I think age and aesthetics is also important. The big question, of course, is like, how accurate are these assessments? And especially, I think, in the kind of contemporary era, as we read about the increased financialization of housing and more small rental properties and indeed single family homes being bought by kind of big investment backed landlords and other companies. I think it begs an important question: how accurate are these assessments, and therefore who are they really going easy on or coming down hard on? And the kind of even bigger question, or the sort of even bigger context of this is that most cities, and some scholars, I'm happy to follow with citations for this, but some people are beginning to kind of scratch at the surface of this, but many cities really don't know who owns what. So on one hand, I can't tell you for sure how accurate their assessments are, but that's also because there's no real kind of measure, there's no real way to know in some cases who owns what.
Oh, that's interesting. Because so this line of questioning, and there are several questions around this, are about the ulterior motives that may be occurring, maybe with the inspectors, but also with maybe the landlords around potential desires for gentrification, for evicting people, and the use of housing quality inspections as a way to go about that. Did you get any sense of that from the conversations that you had with some of the inspectors about maybe this is somebody who is purposely trying to get rid of people, tenants?
You mean for the inspectors trying to get rid of people, or thinking that the landlords were?
That exactly their thoughts. Well, I guess the inspectors' thoughts about what the landlords were doing.
Yeah. I can think about that some more, but I mean, not really, because I think on the most part they were heavily suspicious of the kind of intentions of landlords and the kind of the conditions that they provide for tenants. And I mean, I think there has been a decent amount of attention to some of the ways that building inspections have been used kind of for, sort of basically it kind of been used as sort of pawns in urban development and worked for city governments and kind of growth machine coalitions trying to turn neighborhoods over, etc. And I really can't deny that happens, but I also just feel like we're really missing the whole picture if we focus on that, because most of the majority of inspections are just inspectors kind of by themselves without any kind of like alderman prerogative in their minds going to buildings and making decisions.
Right. And on that note, there were several questions around potential corruption. Like, I don't know how much you were able to document, if any, of the inspectors that you were touring with, we're taking a bribe on the side, but clearly this is something that comes up whenever we're talking about the history of building codes in this country. So I'm not sure if there was any sort of conversation about like what sort of ethical standards are imposed or. Yeah.
I mean, this is definitely it's been an issue, and it's been an issue to the extent that I think it really plagues the minds of a lot of building inspectors who are just trying to do their jobs. So I think I talk about this in more detail in the book, but there are a couple of things that I think are important. First, I actually think that the history of corruption among building inspectors tends to show that it has been more often than not the inspectors who go and inspect new construction, as opposed to the inspectors who who I spent time with, because very often they don't actually meet people. They just turn up to these buildings and decide what violations they see. They rarely meet property owners, they rarely meet tenants. So there isn't really that kind of interpersonal situation for a bribery to occur. And I did
Again,
talk to
so for the audience to know that because these are 311 calls, right?
yeah,
that are
right. And there's no,
ostensibly
and they're not
anonymous, right?
scheduled, right? Yeah, so I should explain this. So they're not scheduled ahead of time. So very often an inspector will turn up at a building with just the address and the issue that was mentioned on the call. They will ring the doorbell, they'll knock on the door, but if no one's home, they can't get inside. So it's really not a perfect system, but this is the system that is in place right now. So there aren't actually that many occasions for conversations, whether they be to do with bribery or not, to occur. And the other thing that I think is important is that I did speak to inspectors about bribery and the kind of history. And for so many of them, this is, like I said, this is a kind of reputation that really plagues them, and they think it makes it really hard for them to sort of do their jobs. And many of them, I think one inspector told me, why would I waste my pension, my benefits, my pension on, a one-off bribe that I might also end up going to prison for? It's just sort of not worth it. So that's my take on that question.
Great. So I've actually been holding the two biggest sets of questions for the end. And I'm sure everybody who's been posing these questions have been wondering, why isn't he asking these questions? Because there's such an amazing, we're going to have to compile these lists of questions and send them to you, Dr. Bartram, afterwards, so that you can do some other op-eds around them. But one of them is the equity associated with this process of informing, with the 311 calls, right? Because clearly people of a certain background and resource and bandwidth and familiarity with 311 are going to be the ones who are making these calls. So, you talk about solution sets in your book, but I want to talk about that, just the process of in which these triggers are created and how they're recorded. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about actually resolving the quality problems in the second question.
Yeah, so this is, like, as you're suggesting, this really is not it's far from a perfect system, right? That the getting someone to do something about the condition of your home necessitates that you make a call, how to make this call. Even if you make the call, sometimes it's months before an inspector comes out to respond to it. So it really isn't perfect. And I think, so there are a lot of different organizations in Chicago and elsewhere that are calling for kind of proactive rental inspections. So to basically necessitate that any landlord renting out any part of their building, or sometimes this only applies to bigger landlords with bigger buildings, would get an inspection, like an annual inspection, for example, to check on the condition of the units. And generally this has they don't tend to get very far, because kind of real estate interests and landlord interests are opposed to these kinds of measures. And I think that this is absolutely one way forward that would make a difference. However, I really think that we would also need to have some kind of system of rent control to make sure that landlords can't just use this as an additional reason to hike rents in already completely unaffordable units.
So it's a range of solutions that you're presenting, right? So absolutely. One is equity in the reporting and how city actually do these inspections in a more consistent fashion and transparent fashion. The second is what happens when somebody's forced to repair. So let's talk about and the effects on the households, but let's talk about the big bulk of questions about solution sets is one that I know speaks very much to your interest in terms of municipal home repair programs, like for those low to moderate income property owners who really do want to do right by their tenants and by the city. What is available to them? So in Chicago, as in I'm guessing most cities, there's very little money that those programs exist, but there's highly under-resourced. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are a decent number of programs, both from local governments and also from nonprofits, that do provide some repair work to mostly owner-occupied homes, so not usually for landlords. Sometimes the kind of small-time landlords are eligible, but not often. These programs are great, but there just aren't enough funds. I mean, the amount of work that they can do on any one particular building is limited, and the number of buildings they can do is limited just because of a lack of funds. So I really think that so this is actually part of my second book project, is sort of thinking, is studying some of these programs and trying to build on the kind of potential, really. One thing that I think is really exciting is in Pennsylvania this summer, they passed something called the Whole Home Repairs Bill, which is the first statewide program that I'm aware of that is kind of basically geared towards this very thing. So providing homeowners and small-time landlords with, I think, up to $50,000 to make home repairs. And the idea is that this is an issue that is, our housing stock is aging. It's not getting any younger. It's increasingly it's increasingly causing issues to do with health, environmental issues, preventing the transfer of intergenerational wealth, etc. So the idea is that we need, and this is exactly what I kind of would call for myself, we need a top-down, large, wholesale investment in existing housing. Like the response to the affordable housing crisis is, I think, too often just to build more housing as opposed to spending money on the existing housing stock that desperately needs repair.
Interesting point. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that there's particularly any colleagues from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the audience, that their home and CDBG funds are used by a lot of municipal repair programs. But again, those are highly under-resourced programs. And the Pennsylvania program is the first state to contribute its own resources to developing a statewide, right? In addition to any federal money that municipalities are using. And the interesting thing about Pennsylvania, of course, is that they're also trying to make sure that basic repairs are done so that weatherization funds that also come from federal dollars can help supplement, but for a different, specific performance reason, not just like the fundamental challenges. So I'm sorry I'm even talking, because there are 42 great questions in the queue and we have run out of time. So the one question I do want to ask, though, is because we've been talking about these solution sets across systems, but we haven't talked about, are they even connected? Like, did any building inspector actually tell a landlord, oh, but there's also this municipal repair program? Was there any kind of that continuity between services so that you're not just being punitive, but you're also being assistive? Did that happen?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes,
Let's
it did.
talk about that.
Yeah, it did. And I think that this is something else that we could really that I think we have the power to change, is that so we shouldn't just be relying on building inspectors in the know, perhaps mentioning a program to someone they speak with, right? We could reimagine the system of building code enforcement so it isn't purely punitive. And so, if a building inspector sees violations and a building ends up in housing court, perhaps that is a way that we identify a small-time landlord or whatever, a property owner who needs some resources, who needs some funds for repairs. So I think that we could think of ways to merge these two things, merge the existing system of code enforcement with kind of more top-down resources for repairs.
Well, just based on the number of questions that we've gotten, you have a life's work of scholarship ahead of you, Dr. Bartram. And we also have a generation's worth of thought in our housing practices, particularly at the local level. So I can't thank you enough for using our venue to help promote your first book. I'm reminding everybody to make sure to purchase Dr. Bartram's book. And this is, her book is available through University of Chicago Press, Stacked Decks, Building Inspectors and the Reproduction of Urban Inequality. Thank you all for joining today. Stay tuned for future events and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.